In crowded tenement streets, smoky back rooms, shipping docks, gambling halls, and private offices, a network was built piece by piece. Money moved through envelopes, routes shifted overnight, alliances formed in whispered conversations, and orders traveled through layers of intermediaries. While rival bosses fought over corners, one system connected families, businesses, and territories into a coordinated operation. Ledgers replaced rumors, meetings replaced street wars, and schedules replaced improvisation. From prohibition routes to union offices, from nightclubs to courtrooms, every detail was calculated. This was not chaos. It was management, structure, and control, engineered to function quietly until every record, witness, and transaction was finally exposed. Lucky Luciano is a name that carries weight in the world of organized crime, a figure so synonymous with the Mafia that his influence still echoes through the underworld today. But Luciano was no mere gangster. He was a visionary, a man who transformed the chaotic, fragmented world of early 20th century crime into a powerful, well-organized, and extremely profitable business empire. His journey wasn't just one of power, but one of calculated strategy, ruthless ambition, and an understanding of the intricate dynamics of human nature. Through Luciano's rise to prominence, the very fabric of the Mafia was rewritten. It's easy to view Lucky Luciano as a product of his environment, a product of New York's Lower East Side, teeming with crime, corruption, and chaos. Born in the slums, Luciano's path to power began in the world of petty crime, yet it quickly evolved into something far more intricate. This was not just a man who dabbled in the violent trades of his time. Luciano saw something that others did not: the potential to turn the lawless streets into a well-oiled machine of criminal enterprise. His ambition went beyond merely surviving the streets. He sought to dominate them. When we look at the Mafia in the years before Luciano's rise, the picture is anything but unified. The world he inherited was one of disarray, where the Italian-American crime families were often at war with each other, fighting for control of territory, wealth, and power. This was the world of the early 20th century Mafia, chaotic, fragmented, and prone to infighting. Despite their power, the old bosses were largely disorganized, with their influence constrained by personal rivalries and outdated tactics. The traditional honor of the Mafia, while deeply entrenched in the culture, was also a form of self-destructive rigidity that stifled growth and innovation. It was a system that was slowly crumbling under its own weight. The Mafia had been around for decades, but it lacked the cohesion and strategic vision required to truly thrive in the modern world. And then came Luciano. Luciano's genius lay not just in his ruthlessness, but in his ability to see the world differently from his predecessors. He recognized the Mafia's deep flaws and sought to remedy them. The old system, where power was spread across individual families and ruled by capos and dons who were fiercely protective of their autonomy, was fragmented. Luciano understood that in order for the Mafia to thrive, it needed to be consolidated, organized, and streamlined into something that could operate like a legitimate business. This was not just about crime for the sake of crime. This was about creating a long-lasting empire, an empire that could rival the success of any legitimate corporation, where everything from gambling to bootlegging was organized, professional, and above all, profitable. In the early days, Luciano was not the dominant force he would later become. He was a street kid, an immigrant, and an outsider, carving out his reputation among a crowd of men who were often far more established and much older than he was. But it didn't take long for Luciano to make his mark. Early in his career he made powerful alliances, including with men like Meyer Lansky, who shared his vision for the future of organized crime. These alliances were crucial to Luciano's rise, as they provided him with the support and resources needed to overthrow the existing Mafia order. But it was not just his strategic thinking and alliances that set him apart. Luciano was also a master of human psychology. He understood the need for loyalty in the Mafia, but he also saw that loyalty could be bought or broken. In a world where trust was often in short supply, Luciano had a remarkable ability to turn the dynamics of power to his advantage. His understanding of human nature, how people craved power, how they feared retribution, and how they could be manipulated, allowed him to control people with a precision that was terrifying in its efficiency. It's here that Luciano's true genius emerges. He saw the Mafia not as a band of brothers bound by blood ties, but as a business venture that required efficiency, coordination, and above all, profits. While the old dons had relied on violence and personal vendettas to settle disputes, Luciano viewed such actions as inefficient. He introduced a new model, one that utilized a business structure, where the crime families operated with a corporate-like hierarchy. Instead of competing for every territory or engaging in bloody turf wars, Luciano proposed that the families work together, forming a syndicate, and divide the spoils in a way that maximized profit for all parties involved. Luciano's vision became reality when he orchestrated the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between the rival factions of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. This war was the crucible in which Luciano's true power was forged. He played both sides of the conflict, using manipulation and cunning to weaken his enemies and elevate his allies. In the end, he emerged victorious, with Masuria and Maranzano both dead, and the Mafia restructured under his leadership. This was the moment when Luciano solidified his place as the most powerful man in organized crime. But Luciano didn't stop there. After taking control, he implemented a series of reforms that would forever change the Mafia's operations. He consolidated power under a centralized structure, ensuring that key leaders in each territory answered to him directly, thus creating a more organized and controlled enterprise. The days of chaotic, uncoordinated violence were replaced by a business-like approach to crime. This was the dawn of the corporate mafia, and Luciano was the CEO. His empire grew rapidly, incorporating everything from gambling to narcotics trafficking, and it became incredibly profitable. Yet even as Luciano built his empire, he remained vigilant against threats, both from within and from without. He knew that in the world of organized crime, power was fragile, and one could never afford to rest on their laurels. Betrayal, particularly from within, was always lurking around the corner. Luciano's world was one of constant tension, where even the most loyal allies could turn on you if the price was right. This constant game of manipulation, power struggles, and the delicate balance of loyalty and fear would come to define Luciano's reign. Luciano's genius, however, wasn't just in his ability to build an empire, it was also in his understanding of when to step back and allow the business to run itself. Unlike many of the mafia bosses before him, Luciano didn't rely solely on brute force to maintain his power. Instead, he preferred to operate behind the scenes, pulling the strings from the shadows. This allowed him to avoid the public spotlight and the scrutiny that came with it, even as he maintained total control over the mafia's operations. This approach allowed him to continue operating without attracting the same kind of law enforcement attention that other bosses were subjected to. He created an invisible empire, one that could not easily be dismantled or penetrated. But as Luciano's power grew, so did the dangers surrounding him. In a world where betrayal was often the price of survival, Luciano's own downfall would eventually be a product of his own methods. As much as he could control the underworld, there were always those who were willing to betray him for power, money, or self-preservation. And just as he had orchestrated the downfall of Masuria and Maranzano, so too would others conspire to take him down. His eventual arrest, the betrayal of key allies, and the courtroom drama that followed would be a stark reminder of how even the most powerful figures in history are not immune to the laws of loyalty and betrayal. But even in his downfall, Luciano never lost his ability to shape events from behind the scenes. His exile and subsequent return to Italy were merely the final chapters in the story of a man who had redefined the rules of organized crime, transforming it into something far more powerful and complex than it had ever been before. His empire may have faltered, but the legacy he left behind, an empire of criminal enterprise that would inspire generations to come, was an indelible mark on history. In the end, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a mob boss, he was a revolutionary. A man who redefined what it meant to rule an empire, not with raw violence and brute force, but with intelligence, strategy, and an understanding of the human condition. He saw the world as a series of opportunities, and where others saw chaos and violence, Luciano saw business. And that vision, more than anything, is what set him apart. The world he left behind was not just the mafia, it was a new way of thinking about power, loyalty, and the pursuit of control. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the mafia into a sprawling criminal empire, the underworld in America was a disorganized, fragmented mess. Organized crime had existed for decades, but the mafia as we understand it today was far from what it would become under Luciano's leadership. In the years leading up to his rise, the mafia was a fractured entity, held together more by tradition and violence than by any cohesive strategy or unity. The streets of New York were a battleground for competing factions, each vying for power, wealth, and influence, with little regard for the long-term stability of their operations. At this time, the mafia was composed of various independent families that ruled their territories with iron fists. The old world of crime was not a well-oiled machine, but rather a loose collection of criminal enterprises, each with its own set of rules, its own leadership, and its own vision of power. Rivalries between families were fierce, often leading to violent clashes. These mob bosses operated with their own agendas, and instead of cooperation, their interactions were steeped in mistrust, territorialism, and greed. The world Luciano would inherit was one in which the Mafia, despite its potential for greatness, was doomed to remain a chaotic, unsustainable system without the right leadership. The Mafia structure was much more traditional during this period, with power residing in the hands of the so-called Dons, the godfathers of each crime family. These men wielded absolute authority in their territories, but their control was constantly threatened by outside forces. Law enforcement and rival mobsters regularly encroached upon their power, and their ability to maintain their rule depended on brute force rather than strategic acumen. The individual Mafia bosses were often stubborn and resistant to change, holding on to the old ways even as the world around them rapidly modernized. The loyalty of their soldiers was a sacred bond, but their governance was far from efficient. Instead of a unified criminal syndicate, these families were more akin to competing warlords, each trying to extend their reach and influence without any overarching plan or direction. At the heart of this world stood two key figures, Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. These men were the epitome of the old-school Mafia bosses, powerful, ruthless, and determined to retain their dominion over the criminal landscape of New York. Both were fierce competitors for control of the city's vast criminal empire, each with their own distinct approach to leadership. Masuria, the more traditional of the two, had a direct, no-nonsense style of rule. He relied heavily on violence to maintain his power and demanded absolute loyalty from his subordinates. His reign was defined by his brute strength, his personal alliances, and his ability to eliminate rivals through sheer force. Maranzano, on the other hand, was a man who saw the potential for a more organized and hierarchical system within the Mafia. He was instrumental in organizing the first nationwide Mafia Commission, in 1931, a council that would serve as the central governing body for all Mafia families in America. Unlike Masuria, who preferred a more chaotic and militaristic approach, Maranzano envisioned a system of structured power that could ensure a level of cooperation between the various families. His idea was to divide the Mafia into regions, with each family controlling a specific geographic area. Maranzano's aim was to create stability, but the method he proposed was one based on hierarchy, where power was distributed in a way that made each boss responsible for a particular piece of territory. In theory, this would allow the families to work together more efficiently and protect each other's interests. However, Maranzano's vision was met with resistance from other powerful figures within the Mafia, including those who felt threatened by his attempts to centralize authority. For all their efforts to impose some order on the Mafia, Masuria and Maranzano represented the old guard's fatal flaw, a reluctance to adapt to the changing world around them. Their constant infighting and violent power struggles ensured that the Mafia was always on the verge of collapse. It was a world where alliances were fleeting, and loyalty was often overshadowed by personal ambition and the thirst for power. The two men were emblematic of the larger problem, the inability of the Mafia's leadership to unify and evolve. Their methods, rooted in violence and entrenched in old traditions, were ultimately unsustainable in a world where crime had become more sophisticated, and the forces of law enforcement were becoming increasingly powerful. The old Mafia had reached a breaking point, and its survival depended on a new breed of leader, one who could bring order to chaos and think beyond the limitations of the old ways. Enter Lucky Luciano. Born into this world of disarray, Luciano was a product of his environment, yet he was also keenly aware of its flaws. Unlike Masuria or Maranzano, Luciano understood that the world of crime needed to adapt to survive. His experience on the streets of New York gave him a profound understanding of human nature, and he saw that the Mafia's old ways were only holding it back. The constant violence and infighting not only drained resources, but it also left the Mafia vulnerable to external threats. Law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated, and rival criminal organizations were rising across the country. Luciano saw an opportunity to unite the fractured underworld into something far more powerful than it had ever been before. Luciano wasn't the only one to see the need for change. The young man was not alone in his desire to modernize the Mafia. There were others who shared his vision, men like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, who understood that the future of organized crime lay in unification and professionalism. They saw that crime could be more than just violence and extortion. It could be a business, one that was run with precision and intelligence. This would be the cornerstone of Luciano's vision, to take the fragmented world of crime and turn it into a network of interlocking, professional enterprises that could operate efficiently and remain protected from both law enforcement and rival factions. While the old bosses had clung to outdated notions of power, Luciano embraced innovation. He was the first to recognize that the Mafia could not survive if it continued to operate as a loose collection of independent families. Instead, he worked tirelessly to create a structure that would allow the families to cooperate, share resources, and maintain a balance of power. He would become the central figure who united these competing interests, forging alliances with other mobsters who shared his desire for something better, something bigger. Through his tactical genius, he orchestrated the end of the brutal Castellammarese War, which had torn apart the Mafia for years, and emerged as the sole power behind the new order. This was the turning point, the moment when the old Mafia began to fade into history, and a new era was born. Luciano was the man who brought stability to the underworld, but not in the traditional sense. His empire wasn't built on a foundation of brute strength or feudal loyalty. It was built on a vision of crime as a business, a vision that would change the course of organized crime forever. What Luciano understood that others didn't was that the Mafia could never truly thrive unless it embraced modernity, efficiency, and unity. He sought to create a business that was immune to the chaos of the old ways, a business that could withstand the forces of law enforcement and political pressure. The old bosses could not see it, but Luciano did. Only through cooperation and professionalism could the Mafia hope to endure. This was the beginning of Luciano's empire, one built on the lessons of the past, but with a clear eye on the future. Born into the harsh, unforgiving streets of New York's Lower East Side, Salvatore Lucky Luciano's rise from a scrappy immigrant child to the most powerful mob boss in the history of organized crime is a story of ambition, grit, and a unique understanding of power. Raised in poverty, his early life was one defined by struggle and survival, surrounded by crime, violence, and an ever-present sense of danger. Luciano's path was anything but predestined. In fact, it was a product of the environment that shaped him. But within that chaos he found a way to excel and, eventually, to thrive. Luciano was born in 1897 in Sicily, Italy, and immigrated to the United States with his family when he was just a child. Like many immigrants at the time, his family faced significant hardships as they settled in the bustling streets of New York. The Lower East Side was a melting pot of cultures, and the tension between different ethnic groups, particularly among the Italian, Jewish, and Irish communities, was palpable. For a young boy like Luciano, this environment was a crucible, a place where only the toughest survived. His early exposure to crime was inevitable, as the streets around him were filled with both opportunity and peril. The neighborhood was a hotbed of gang activity, and young Luciano quickly became familiar with the criminal underworld that was already taking root in the city. His childhood was one of poverty and hardship, with his family struggling to make ends meet. Despite this, Luciano showed an early aptitude for survival. He learned quickly that to thrive in the Lower East Side, one needed to be resourceful and, above all, tough. Crime wasn't just an option, it was a necessity, and Luciano recognized it as a means of securing a better future for himself. By his early teens he was already involved in petty theft, small-time hustles, and running errands for local gangsters. His charm and street smarts quickly won him the respect of his peers, and before long he found himself entrenched in the criminal world. It was in the midst of this environment that Luciano's true talents began to emerge. While most young men in his position were content to operate as foot soldiers in the street gangs, Luciano had a vision for something bigger. He was not content with merely participating in crime. He wanted to control it. This ambition set him apart from many of his peers, who were content to live in the shadows of the more powerful mob figures of the time. Luciano had no intention of being just another street thug, he aimed for the top. And in a world where power was defined by ruthlessness and cunning, he would stop at nothing to achieve it. His first significant break came in the form of a mentor, a powerful gangster named Arnold Rothstein, a Jewish mob boss who was known for his involvement in fixing baseball games, bootlegging, and other illicit activities. Rothstein recognized Luciano's potential and took him under his wing. This mentorship would prove to be pivotal in Luciano's development as a criminal mastermind. Rothstein was a man of business, and he imparted his knowledge of organized crime as a means of generating consistent, reliable profits. Unlike many of the old-school bosses, Rothstein understood that crime could be run like a business, with careful planning, organization, and strategic thinking. Under Rothstein's tutelage, Luciano began to learn the art of running a criminal enterprise, something that would become his hallmark in the years to come. By the time he was in his early 20s, Luciano had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with in the world of organized crime. But he wasn't just another thug with street-level ambitions. Luciano was already beginning to think bigger, much bigger. He saw the fractured nature of the Mafia, the constant power struggles between rival families, and he recognized that if he wanted to build a lasting empire, he would need to bring some order to the chaos. While other gangsters were focused on fighting for territory, Luciano was thinking about how to unite the various factions into a cohesive and powerful syndicate. He believed that the Mafia's power would not come from endless infighting, but from cooperation and strategic alliances. This was the foundation of his rise. His first major move came in the early 1920s when he became involved in the lucrative and ever-growing bootlegging business during Prohibition. As the federal government imposed a ban on alcohol, the demand for illegal liquor skyrocketed, and Luciano saw this as an opportunity to make his mark. He didn't just want to be a supplier, he wanted to control the entire distribution network. He used his street connections and the lessons he had learned from Rothstein to establish a system of smuggling, distribution, and protection that would soon become the backbone of his criminal empire. But Luciano didn't stop there. He was no longer just interested in running illegal booze. He saw the broader potential for organized crime, and he began to expand into other areas, including gambling, prostitution, and narcotics. What set Luciano apart from the other mob bosses was his ability to build alliances. He didn't view the Mafia as a collection of independent families but as a network that could function more efficiently if it were united under one central authority. This vision of a consolidated Mafia was radical for its time. The traditional bosses, like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were stuck in the old ways, a fragmented, personalistic system where power was wielded by individuals who were only interested in their own gain. Luciano, however, recognized that the future of the Mafia lay in unity. He understood that in order to build a sustainable empire, the various factions needed to cooperate and share profits. This was the beginning of what would later become the modern Mafia syndicate. His rise to power was not without its challenges. There were those who resisted his vision of a unified Mafia, and they were more than willing to use violence to maintain their positions. The Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between the factions of Masuria and Maranzano, was the turning point in Luciano's career. Luciano saw the war as an opportunity to eliminate the old guard and seize control of the Mafia. By strategically aligning himself with key players, including the powerful gangster Meyer Lansky, he was able to orchestrate the downfall of both Masuria and Maranzano, effectively ending the chaos that had plagued the Mafia for years. Luciano's ability to manipulate events from behind the scenes during this war was a testament to his growing political acumen. Unlike the brute force approach of the old bosses, Luciano used intelligence and careful planning to outmaneuver his enemies. His victory in the Castellamarese War marked the beginning of his reign as the most powerful man in organized crime, and from there he set about building the infrastructure that would allow him to run his empire with ruthless efficiency. It was also during this time that Luciano solidified his relationship with other key figures who would become instrumental in his rise. Meyer Lansky, his most trusted ally, was not just a criminal mastermind but a businessman who shared Luciano's vision for a professionalized Mafia. Together, they began to develop the systems of operation that would transform the Mafia into a global enterprise. Lansky's expertise in finance and organization complemented Luciano's ability to forge alliances and manage power dynamics. Frank Costello, another key figure, would later play a crucial role in Luciano's rise, providing valuable support in the face of mounting pressure from both law enforcement and rival factions. Luciano's ability to control the various factions of the Mafia and bring them under one central authority was groundbreaking. He not only unified the families but also created a formal system of governance, the Commission, which allowed the families to work together to resolve disputes and share profits. This system helped to stabilize the Mafia and ensured that Luciano could maintain control even as his empire grew larger and more complex. By the time he was in his 30s, Luciano was no longer just a player in the criminal world. He had become the architect of a new era in organized crime. His vision for the Mafia was one of professionalism, unity, and power. But even as his empire grew, Luciano never lost sight of the lessons he had learned on the streets of the Lower East Side. He understood the importance of survival, and he knew that power was always fragile. His rise was built on an ability to navigate both the violent world of organized crime and the more subtle nuances of human nature. It was this combination of street smarts and strategic thinking that made him one of the most formidable figures in the history of organized crime. Lucky Luciano's genius was not just in his ability to dominate the criminal underworld, it was in his vision for organizing it. While the Mafia had long been associated with lawlessness and violence, Luciano saw the potential to transform it into a business. A professional, streamlined criminal enterprise that could generate profits on a scale never before seen. Unlike the mobsters of the past who ran their operations like warlords, Luciano envisioned a system of criminal organizations that function like a corporation. This was a revolutionary idea that would fundamentally change the nature of organized crime forever. At the heart of this transformation was Luciano's ability to see the Mafia not as a collection of independent, competing families, but as a network of interdependent criminal enterprises. Prior to Luciano's rise, the Mafia operated in a decentralized manner. Each family was its own sovereign entity, ruling over its territory with an iron fist. While there were alliances and agreements between families, these were often fragile and subject to betrayal, as power struggles and personal vendettas frequently undermined them. This fragmentation created a lack of coordination and left the Mafia vulnerable to both law enforcement and rival criminal organizations. Luciano understood that in order for the Mafia to survive and thrive in the long term, it needed to be reorganized, streamlined, and made more efficient. He also realized that the world was changing. The old ways of doing business, relying solely on violence and intimidation, would no longer suffice. The rise of federal law enforcement, especially the FBI, meant that the Mafia could no longer operate with impunity. The authorities were becoming more adept at investigating organized crime, and the days of the untouchable gangster were coming to an end. Luciano knew that in order to outlast these pressures, the Mafia had to modernize. It needed to adopt a more sophisticated approach that would allow it to operate beneath the radar, blending in with legitimate businesses and evading law enforcement scrutiny. Luciano's answer to this problem was simple yet revolutionary. He turned the Mafia into a business. The way he accomplished this was by establishing a hierarchical structure that mirrored corporate America. Instead of each family operating as a separate entity, Luciano created a unified top-down structure where each family was assigned a role within a larger, coordinated system. This new Mafia would be managed like a corporation, with a clear division of labor and a focus on profitability rather than personal vendettas. The Mafia would no longer be a chaotic, infighting organization. It would be a well-oiled machine running smoothly, efficiently, and with the precision of a business empire. Central to this new structure was the creation of the Mafia Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the major families. The commission was designed to act as the central decision-making body for the entire Mafia. Any disputes between families would be resolved through the commission, ensuring that conflicts didn't devolve into all-out war. This was a monumental shift in how the Mafia operated. Whereas before, Mafia families were constantly at odds with each other, Luciano's commission allowed them to work together for the common good of the Mafia as a whole. By formalizing the structure of the Mafia, Luciano created a system that could not only survive but thrive in an increasingly hostile world. The structure was not just about managing disputes or dividing territories. It was also about ensuring that the Mafia operated as a true criminal enterprise, with a focus on generating wealth and sustaining power. Luciano's approach was heavily influenced by his understanding of business. He recognized that the Mafia had the potential to become a highly profitable organization, but only if it was organized efficiently. This meant creating new revenue streams and finding ways to cut down on wasteful competition between families. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to turn the Mafia's traditional vices, gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging, into highly profitable, well-run industries. One of the first areas Luciano focused on was gambling. While gambling had always been a significant source of income for the Mafia, Luciano understood that it could be expanded and systematized. He began to implement more organized, large-scale operations, including illegal casinos and racetracks. He brought in experts, including some of his trusted allies like Meyer Lansky, who had a keen understanding of finance and business operations. Lansky helped Luciano turn gambling into a massive business, expanding operations across the country and ensuring that every penny was accounted for. Luciano was a master of turning crime into a business, and gambling would become one of his most profitable ventures. Prostitution was another area Luciano sought to professionalize. While prostitution had always been part of the Mafia's business model, Luciano recognized that it could be better managed and more profitable if it was streamlined. Instead of leaving the management of brothels and sex workers to individual family bosses, Luciano established a centralized system that coordinated operations and ensured a steady flow of income. He made sure that the women were protected and that their services were marketed effectively, turning prostitution into a highly profitable, low-maintenance business. This system allowed Luciano to control the trade without the chaos and violence that had characterized it in the past. Bootlegging, of course, was the lifeblood of Luciano's early success. Prohibition had created a massive demand for illegal alcohol, and Luciano capitalized on this demand like no one before him. But his genius lay in the way he organized and streamlined the bootlegging trade. Rather than relying on small-time operators to smuggle alcohol, Luciano created a vast network of distribution channels that allowed him to dominate the market. He forged alliances with politicians, law enforcement officials, and other criminal organizations, creating an impenetrable web of connections that ensured his operations ran smoothly. Luciano didn't just smuggle alcohol. He built an empire of liquor sales that spanned across cities and states, ensuring that he controlled every aspect of the supply chain. But it wasn't just the vices themselves that he was organizing, it was the entire structure of crime. Luciano was a master at managing people, and he understood that loyalty, while important, had to be balanced with efficiency. He created a hierarchical system within the Mafia, with a clear chain of command and well-defined roles for everyone involved. At the top were the dons of the major families, who were responsible for overseeing operations in their territories. Beneath them were the capos, who managed smaller groups of soldiers, and at the bottom were the foot soldiers who carried out the day-to-day work of the Mafia. This pyramid structure ensured that everyone had a defined role and that the Mafia could operate like a well-oiled machine. Luciano's vision of organized crime as a business didn't just apply to the traditional Mafia activities, it extended to everything he did. He was meticulous in his planning and operations, and he surrounded himself with like-minded individuals who shared his commitment to building an empire. He brought in people with skills beyond the world of crime, such as financial experts and logistics coordinators, to help run his operations more efficiently. This allowed Luciano to expand his reach beyond New York and into other major cities, making him one of the most powerful figures in organized crime history. The success of Luciano's business model was not just in its profitability, it was in its sustainability. While the old Mafia was often at the mercy of law enforcement, rival criminals, and internal strife, Luciano's Mafia was built to last. He understood that in order for the organization to thrive, it needed to be flexible, adaptable, and above all, professional. The businesses he ran were profitable, but they were also stable. Luciano was able to stay out of the public eye, allowing his empire to grow without drawing too much attention. By keeping a low profile and running the Mafia like a business, he ensured that his empire would endure long after the old guard had fallen. Through his vision and leadership, Luciano didn't just build a criminal empire. He created a new model for organized crime, one that would serve as the template for future generations. His success was rooted in his ability to see the bigger picture, to recognize that crime could be run like a business and that the Mafia's future depended on professionalizing its operations. The result was a unified, powerful, and incredibly profitable organization that changed the face of organized crime forever. The Mafia, as we know it today, is governed by a set of unspoken rules, one of the most sacred being the Omerta, the Code of Silence. This code binds the Mafia together, creating an atmosphere where loyalty and secrecy are paramount, and betrayal is the ultimate sin. Omerta was not merely a rule, it was a way of life for the men who lived by it. It governed their actions, their relationships, and their very survival within the criminal underworld. And it was the very fabric that held together the chaotic, often violent world of organized crime. But the code wasn't simply a set of instructions or expectations. It was a psychological tool that ensured control over the Mafia's members. Luciano, in particular, understood the significance of Omerta better than most. To him, the code was not just about maintaining secrecy, it was about power and fear. By ensuring that no one could talk to the authorities or outsiders, the Mafia protected itself from law enforcement and kept its operations running smoothly. More importantly, it kept the members in line, ensuring that loyalty to the organization took precedence over everything else, even family or personal interests. Omerta was deeply ingrained in the Mafia's culture. To break it was to break the one thing that kept the organization intact: trust. Without trust, the very foundation of the Mafia would crumble. The idea of snitching, or cooperating with law enforcement, was the worst possible offense in the eyes of any made man. The penalty for betrayal was harsh and often deadly. In the eyes of the Mafia, a person who broke the code was as good as dead, regardless of their past loyalty or achievements. But for Luciano, the code was more than just a shield to protect the Mafia from outsiders, it was also a method of control. He knew that the power of the Mafia was built on a delicate balance of fear and loyalty. While loyalty ensured that the members would follow orders without question, fear made sure that those who even thought of crossing the line would think twice before doing so. Omerta created an unbreakable bond between the members of the Mafia. It allowed Luciano to operate with a level of security and power that few could challenge. While the code might seem to outsiders like a simple way of keeping secrets, It also allowed Luciano to create a culture of discipline and respect within the Mafia. He was not just a leader by virtue of his criminal acumen, he was the embodiment of the Mafia's ideals. By maintaining strict adherence to omerta, Luciano solidified his position as the unquestioned boss of the Mafia. The code didn't just apply to the underlings, it applied to everyone from the lowest foot soldiers to the most powerful dons. It became the glue that held the whole system together. To break the code was to break the bond that tied the Mafia to its own existence. Omerta's influence extended far beyond the Mafia's internal structure. It shaped how the Mafia interacted with the world outside. Luciano understood that the Mafia could not operate in a vacuum. It needed to interact with businesses, politicians, law enforcement, and even the general public. And yet, it had to remain a shadowy, mysterious force, one that could never be fully exposed to the light. This is where the code became truly crucial. By ensuring that its members remained silent about the organization's activities, the Mafia could carry out its business without fear of interference from outsiders. Any informant or traitor was an existential threat to this delicate balance. It was the reason Luciano could continue to operate on such a grand scale while keeping his hands relatively clean. Moreover, omerta also played a role in the Mafia's perception of power and respect. The code created a hierarchy within the Mafia, where the higher up a person was in the ranks, the more respect they commanded. Breaking the code was not just a betrayal of the organization, it was a betrayal of the respect that everyone in the Mafia had for each other. In a world where respect was paramount, this was the most unforgivable sin. For a man like Luciano, this respect was crucial. It gave him the power to command loyalty from his soldiers, the power to control the families, and the power to maintain his hold over the criminal empire he had built. The psychology behind omerta was multifaceted. On one level it was about loyalty. But on a deeper level it was about survival. For many members of the Mafia, especially those who had grown up in poverty and violence, the Mafia was a means of survival. It was the one thing that gave their lives meaning and direction. To betray the organization was to betray the only family they had ever known. It was a psychological trap. Once a man entered the world of the Mafia, he became entangled in its rules, its structure, and its way of life. Leaving was often not an option. Breaking the code was not just a betrayal of an organization, it was a betrayal of everything that had shaped their identity. Luciano, in particular, mastered the psychological aspect of omerta. He understood that loyalty could not be forced. It had to be cultivated, nurtured, and reinforced. Through his charisma, his ruthlessness, and his strategic alliances, Luciano made sure that his soldiers knew their place and that they understood the consequences of stepping out of line. At the same time, he was careful to build relationships of trust and respect with his key allies. He made sure that his family, his closest confidants, were always rewarded for their loyalty, which in turn solidified their commitment to the cause. But there was another side to the code, the darker side. While loyalty and trust were integral to omerta, fear was equally important. The Mafia was built on the principle that anyone who broke the code would suffer severe consequences. These consequences weren't just theoretical, they were real, brutal, and swift. For Luciano, this was an essential aspect of the system. Fear, in his eyes, was just as important as loyalty. A fear of retribution, of the brutal consequences that would follow a betrayal, was what kept the members of the Mafia in check. Luciano's ability to maintain a system of loyalty and fear was critical to his success. He had the uncanny ability to know when to show mercy and when to exact punishment. In some cases he would show leniency, offering a second chance to those who had shown their worth and who had proven their loyalty. In other cases he would mete out swift and unforgiving punishment to those who had crossed the line. This was part of his mastery of the psychology of power. By keeping his followers in a state of uncertainty, never knowing whether they would be rewarded or punished, Luciano kept them on edge and, ultimately, in line. In a sense, Luciano had mastered the human psyche in ways that few others ever could. He understood that people, regardless of their station or role in life, were driven by two basic motivations: fear and desire. By manipulating these forces, he was able to create a criminal empire that was both highly efficient and nearly impossible to bring down. While the Mafia was often seen as a lawless, chaotic world, in reality, it was governed by a very strict set of rules that were reinforced by the all-powerful presence of omerta. For Luciano, the Mafia was not just an organization, it was a microcosm of the world itself. It was a system of relationships, built on power, loyalty, and fear, that governed the lives of everyone involved. And as long as the code of omerta held, so too would the Mafia. It was this understanding of the psychological, social and cultural forces that bound the Mafia together that allowed Luciano to rise to the top, and it was this same understanding that would eventually help him survive even in the face of his own downfall. In the end, Omerta was more than just a set of rules for the Mafia. It was a worldview, a lens through which the members of the organization understood their place in the world. And it was a system that, under Luciano's leadership, was elevated to an art form. The code of silence wasn't just about not talking to the police, it was about maintaining the delicate balance of power, fear and loyalty that held the entire Mafia structure together. Without it, the Mafia would have been nothing more than a loose collection of criminals, doomed to failure. But with Omerta, it became an empire, one that lasted long after Luciano had passed from the scene. The Mafia's true transformation under Lucky Luciano was not just a shift in leadership style, but in how it approached its business operations. Where the old guard relied on brute force and violent power struggles, Luciano revolutionized the way the organization operated by turning crime into an organized, systematic business. He saw criminal activity not just as a means to an end, but as a platform for building a sustainable, profit-driven empire. This vision was crucial to understanding why he was able to build such an enduring criminal syndicate, one that extended far beyond the streets of New York and even beyond the United States. It wasn't enough to control territory. Luciano understood that he had to control industries, smuggling networks, and most importantly, the underlying economics of crime. At the center of Luciano's operation was his understanding of how to transform the Mafia into a multifaceted, streamlined business. Instead of small-time criminal activities operating independently, Luciano sought to integrate these into a larger, cohesive operation that could generate consistent revenue. This wasn't about opportunistic theft or street-level extortion. It was about creating a network of criminal businesses that worked together, shared resources, and were capable of adapting to external pressures like law enforcement crackdowns. For Luciano, it was not just a game of power, but a carefully calculated financial enterprise. One of the first areas where Luciano's business-minded approach became clear was in his expansion of the bootlegging business during Prohibition. Prohibition had created a massive underground market for alcohol, and Luciano recognized it as the golden opportunity for the Mafia to increase its wealth exponentially. But he didn't approach bootlegging like a typical street thug. He treated it as a product, a commodity that needed to be transported, marketed, and distributed efficiently. Under Luciano, the Mafia began to create distribution networks that spanned the country, using a combination of bribed politicians, sympathetic law enforcement, and hidden channels to move large quantities of alcohol without attracting too much attention. This systemic approach to smuggling was crucial to Luciano's success. Rather than relying on small-time criminals or chaotic operations to transport alcohol, Luciano created a network of well-coordinated, reliable operations. His ability to manage large-scale operations and keep them running smoothly was what set him apart from other Mafia figures. He didn't just want to make money in the short term. He wanted to build an organization that could continue to generate wealth year after year, regardless of the political or legal pressures that might arise. The key to this success was the ability to operate beneath the radar, while still maintaining an iron grip on the operations that brought in millions of dollars. But bootlegging was just the beginning. Luciano understood that the Mafia's potential extended beyond alcohol. The criminal enterprise could profit from any number of illegal activities, and it was in his expansion into gambling, narcotics, and other illicit businesses that Luciano began to truly build his empire. One of his most significant achievements was his involvement in the gambling business. While gambling had always been a significant source of income for the Mafia, Luciano recognized that it could be transformed into a highly organized, centralized operation. Instead of leaving gambling to individual families or rogue operators, Luciano sought to systematize the industry, creating a vast network of illegal casinos, racetracks, and other betting outlets that generated immense profits. He understood that the key to success in the gambling business was not just having the right connections, but also the right infrastructure. By investing in reliable, organized operations, Luciano ensured that the gambling arm of his business was running like a well-oiled machine. He was able to expand his reach, both within New York City and beyond, creating a vast network of betting establishments that brought in revenue from people of all walks of life. From high-stakes poker games to street-level numbers rackets, Luciano made sure that the Mafia had its hands in every facet of the gambling world, reaping profits at every level. But it wasn't just about gambling. Luciano understood that organized crime needed to diversify its operations to truly become a global empire. In this way, the Mafia's reach expanded into other profitable ventures such as prostitution, narcotics, and even labor unions. Luciano's operation was characterized by a ruthless efficiency that allowed him to maintain a grip on these industries, while making sure that his operations were intertwined in such a way that no one family or individual could ever truly challenge his authority. Take, for example, his operations in the unions. Unions had long been a source of mafia influence, but Luciano took this to new heights by infiltrating and controlling key labor organizations, particularly in industries like trucking and construction. These unions provided the mafia with an avenue for both money and power, as they controlled vast swaths of the American workforce. By making deals with corrupt union leaders and ensuring that the mafia's presence was felt in every corner of the labor movement, Luciano was able to access new revenue streams, create new alliances, and further solidify his hold over the criminal underworld. The manipulation of labor unions was not just about money, it was about control. By keeping unions under his thumb, Luciano not only ensured that the mafia had a constant flow of funds, but also created a network of loyal allies in positions of power. The mafia could now not only control the streets and the illegal rackets but also the very labor force that fueled the economy. This power allowed Luciano to expand his influence into legitimate industries and even into the political arena, where he made deals with politicians who would turn a blind eye to his operations in exchange for financial support or political favors. Luciano's success in turning crime into a business wasn't just about making money, it was about making his operations sustainable. To accomplish this, he needed to ensure that his mafia was not only profitable but also resilient. He built an intricate network of relationships that linked his criminal activities with legitimate businesses, ensuring that his operations would always have a cover. With his extensive list of corrupt politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officers on his payroll, Luciano ensured that his activities remained shielded from scrutiny. This made his criminal empire nearly untouchable, even as it grew to include new ventures like narcotics distribution. The narcotics business was a natural expansion for Luciano, as it offered the same potential for massive profits as bootlegging did during Prohibition. However, unlike alcohol, the narcotics trade was more high risk, especially with the increasing pressure from law enforcement. Yet, Luciano's foresight allowed him to move cautiously and strategically into this market. He understood that with the right distribution networks, narcotics could become one of the mafia's most lucrative operations, and he was careful to navigate the growing risks without overextending himself. Luciano didn't just dive into the drug business recklessly. He approached it with the same level of calculation and business-minded precision that he applied to other ventures. He built a network of trusted individuals who could run the narcotics trade under his command, keeping the operations at arm's length from his immediate associates to protect himself from legal jeopardy. The key to Luciano's success in these ventures was his uncanny ability to balance risk and reward. He understood that organized crime was a business with inevitable ups and downs, and he made sure to create multiple revenue streams so that no matter what happened, his empire would remain solvent. He was constantly evolving, adapting his operations to meet the ever-changing landscape of law enforcement and competing criminal organizations. His empire was built not on a single source of income but on a diverse and interconnected web of businesses that worked together to ensure the mafia's continued profitability. Luciano's criminal empire was one of power, but it was also one of meticulous planning, foresight, and adaptability. He didn't just control New York, he built an empire that spanned coast to coast and extended into international markets. His vision for the mafia was one that embraced modernity and sophistication, turning traditional crime syndicates into a business operation that could compete with any corporation in America. Luciano didn't just create an empire, he created a blueprint for organized crime that would endure for generations. His legacy was not just in the power he wielded, but in the business structure he pioneered, one that would continue to shape the world of crime for decades to come. The rise of Lucky Luciano was not just about building an empire or consolidating power, it was about navigating a world of shifting allegiances, power struggles, and constant threat. As Luciano ascended in the ranks of the mafia, he realized that allies were just as important, if not more so, than enemies. Rivalries within the mafia were fierce, and Luciano needed to make strategic alliances if he was to secure his hold on the criminal underworld. However, alliances in the world of organized crime were fragile, easily formed but often just as easily shattered. To secure his position, Luciano didn't just rely on brute force or raw ambition. He relied on a shrewd sense of diplomacy, the ability to form partnerships with men who were as ruthless as he was, but who could help him achieve his larger goal, the unification and expansion of the mafia. Early on in his rise to power, Luciano found a vital ally in Meyer Lansky, a fellow immigrant who had come from a poor Jewish family. While Luciano was rising through the ranks of the Italian Mafia, Lansky was carving out his own niche in the underworld, particularly in the realm of gambling. Lansky's keen business sense, particularly in terms of finance, complemented Luciano's vision for transforming the Mafia into a more organized and professional criminal syndicate. While Luciano was busy consolidating power, Lansky was working behind the scenes to help structure the Mafia's various illicit businesses, turning them into more profitable and stable ventures. Together, they formed an incredibly powerful partnership, one that combined Luciano's organizational genius and Lansky's financial expertise. But it wasn't just about business acumen. It was also about loyalty. Luciano understood that trust was the currency of power in the Mafia, and Lansky was among the few he could count on without question. Their relationship would prove invaluable, not only in terms of wealth but in the political machinations required to solidify Luciano's place at the top of the Mafia world. With Lansky by his side, Luciano had an invaluable ally who could secure the financial backing necessary to create the kind of empire Luciano dreamed of. It was a partnership rooted in mutual respect, and it would be tested time and again as they navigated the treacherous waters of Mafia politics. But power in the Mafia was not won solely through alliances. It was also about eliminating threats, sometimes even those within one's own ranks. Luciano understood that the Mafia was inherently a violent world, and that to maintain control, he would have to confront rivals both external and internal. The most significant of these rivals came in the form of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two of the most powerful mob bosses in New York at the time. Both men embodied the old ways of doing business, methods that were rooted in violence, a personalistic approach to control, and constant internal feuds. To Luciano, these men represented everything that was wrong with the Mafia: fractured, disorganized, and driven by petty vendettas. The rivalry between Luciano and Masuria was one of the defining conflicts in his rise to power. Masuria, an old-school boss who believed in the traditional methods of Mafia rule, brutality, fear, and intimidation, had long dominated New York's Mafia scene. But Masuria's control over the city was slipping. The younger generation of Mafia leaders, led by Luciano, were starting to question his methods. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, knew that if he were to establish a new order within the Mafia, one that was based on unity and cooperation, Masuria had to go. In what would become one of the most significant moments of Luciano's career, he made the decision to betray his former boss, Joe Masuria, orchestrating his assassination. Luciano had already begun to work behind the scenes with Masuria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano, a move that set the stage for a violent shift in the Mafia's power structure. By switching allegiances, Luciano demonstrated his pragmatism. He recognized that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was secondary to power. Luciano didn't see the Mafia as a collection of personal relationships or old-school traditions. He saw it as a business. In this business, survival and growth required hard decisions and ruthless actions. Masuria's death was a necessary step in Luciano's quest to reshape the Mafia, and he executed it with cold precision. But his alliance with Maranzano would not last. Maranzano, too, represented the old guard, and Luciano's ultimate goal was to bring about a new order. After Masuria's death, Maranzano declared himself the capo di tutti capi, or the boss of all bosses, an assertion of authority that threatened to undermine the very structure Luciano sought to create. Maranzano's reign, much like Masuria's, was built on personal power, not organizational strength. Luciano understood that Maranzano's vision was not aligned with his own. His goal was to unify the Mafia under a single, collective structure, not return to the traditional model of fragmented, competing families. And so, in a ruthless move that would solidify his position at the top, Luciano had Maranzano murdered, effectively eliminating both of the old bosses in one fell swoop. This was the turning point in Luciano's career. By orchestrating the deaths of Masuria and Maranzano, he removed the last vestiges of the old Mafia order, clearing the way for his vision of a unified, professional, and efficient criminal syndicate to take root. Luciano didn't just want to be a boss. He wanted to be the architect of a new Mafia, a Mafia that could operate like a legitimate business, one that could expand its reach, maximize its profits, and eliminate the inefficiencies that had plagued the organization in the past. With Masuria and Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano was free to create his new system, one that would see the Mafia evolve into a more cohesive, powerful, and profitable entity. But even in this victory, there were threats to Luciano's dominance. While he had eliminated the old bosses, the Mafia was still a fragmented entity, with many smaller families and factions that could challenge his authority. To prevent any such challenges, Luciano began to put in place a system of checks and balances that would ensure that no one family could dominate the others. This system, the Commission, would become the backbone of the new Mafia order. The Commission was a council made up of the heads of the various Mafia families, and its primary purpose was to mediate disputes and ensure that the interests of all families were balanced. The creation of the Commission was a stroke of genius. Luciano understood that the key to long-term success was not absolute power, but shared power, power that could be distributed across different families, while still maintaining central authority. The Commission helped to reduce the infighting that had plagued the Mafia in the past, and it allowed Luciano to consolidate his power without alienating the other families. By making the Mafia more cooperative, he ensured that all families benefited from the system, and he made sure that everyone understood that loyalty to the Commission, and to him, was paramount. At the same time, Luciano continued to expand his influence by forging alliances with other powerful figures in the criminal underworld. He was not just a mob boss, he was a master strategist, constantly seeking out opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. He formed alliances with other crime syndicates, including Jewish and Irish groups, which helped to expand his reach and cement his position at the top. Luciano's ability to navigate these relationships, even with those who were once rivals, was part of what made him such a formidable figure in the world of organized crime. Despite the peace that the Commission brought, Luciano knew that betrayal and treachery were constant threats in the Mafia world. Rival factions were always looking for opportunities to challenge him, and there were those within his own ranks who might attempt to undermine his authority. To counter this, Luciano maintained a tight control over his operations, using his network of loyal men to monitor potential threats. But even with this careful oversight, there were still those who sought to dethrone him. Luciano's reign, while powerful and successful, was never completely secure. In the end, his ability to maintain control over the fractured world of organized crime was a testament to his strategic brilliance, his loyalty to his closest allies, and his ability to navigate the ever-shifting landscape of power within the Mafia. His strategic alliances, careful manipulation of rivalries, and ruthless decision-making ultimately secured his place at the top of the Mafia. But even as he strengthened his hold over the criminal empire, he knew that power was always fleeting, and that every victory was simply one step in an ongoing battle for survival. The Mafia was always a world of secrets, shadows, and shifting loyalties. Luciano understood that the underworld, by its very nature, was a high-risk business, and in order to survive, he needed to constantly adapt to the external pressures from both rival criminals and, more importantly, law enforcement. The game was no longer just about outsmarting the competition. It was about staying one step ahead of the government. As the 1930s wore on, the government's crackdown on organized crime became more relentless, and the stakes for Luciano grew higher. But rather than retreating or playing it safe, Luciano doubled down, using his growing influence to further entrench his position in the criminal world. The early 1930s marked a critical period for Luciano, one that would test his ability to survive in an increasingly hostile environment. By this time he had already orchestrated the downfall of both Masuria and Maranzano, but his real test was yet to come. While Luciano had been securing power in New York, the federal government under President Franklin D. Roosevelt had begun to focus more intensively on organized crime, and the FBI, led by the determined J. Edgar Hoover, was closing in. The rise of federal law enforcement, coupled with local police forces becoming better equipped to investigate the Mafia, created a dire situation for men like Luciano. In many ways, the greatest danger was not just the law enforcement agencies themselves, but the changing nature of the American political system. The Great Depression had swept through the country, leading to widespread economic devastation. As the public's frustrations with crime and corruption grew, law enforcement was under increasing pressure to crack down on organized crime syndicates like Luciano's. The federal government, bolstered by new laws such as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, started targeting the Mafia with more intense scrutiny. The government's increased attention on the Mafia was not merely a passing phase. It signaled a more concerted effort to bring down the criminal empires that had flourished during Prohibition. Luciano, however, was not a man who would go down quietly. He recognized that to stay ahead of the authorities, he needed to operate in a way that was both efficient and insulated from the law. His understanding of law enforcement was profound. He knew that while local authorities could harass his operations, the real threat was the federal government, with its vast resources, investigative techniques, and the power to bring him down in a way no local cop could. Luciano's plan, however, was simple yet effective. He would distance himself from the day-to-day operations of the Mafia, creating a network of layers that would insulate him from direct involvement in illegal activities. He understood that in order to avoid prosecution, he needed to operate with the utmost discretion. Luciano became more of a behind-the-scenes figure, a strategist rather than a hands-on criminal boss. His role evolved into one of coordinating and overseeing the operations of others, allowing him to maintain his power while reducing the risk of being directly implicated in any crime. He used his influence to control the major criminal activities, drug trafficking, gambling, prostitution, without getting his hands dirty. Instead of being directly involved in these illegal enterprises, Luciano delegated the day-to-day operations to trusted lieutenants, keeping himself removed from any evidence that might link him to criminal activity. While he did this, Luciano worked tirelessly to expand his empire even further. One of his major successes during this period was his involvement in the heroin trade, which became one of the most lucrative illicit businesses in the Mafia's arsenal. The heroin business was different from bootlegging or gambling in that it required more secrecy and finesse to manage. But Luciano, with his vast network of contacts and his growing influence in international crime circles, saw an opportunity. He worked to establish ties with European and Asian syndicates, creating a vast heroin trafficking operation that stretched across borders. This expansion into the heroin trade was crucial for Luciano, as it provided an entirely new stream of income, one that was not as vulnerable to the same enforcement pressures as his other operations. But as Luciano's power continued to grow, so did the attention he drew from the authorities. Despite his efforts to operate in the shadows, his criminal activities began to catch up with him. His empire was vast, and his reach was international, which made it all the more difficult for him to avoid the eyes of the law. The FBI in particular was eager to take him down. Under Hoover's leadership, the Bureau intensified its investigations into the Mafia, with the ultimate goal of breaking up the criminal syndicates that were entrenched in American society. The pressure from law enforcement was mounting, and despite Luciano's attempts to keep a low profile, his world was beginning to unravel. It was during this period of growing government pressure that Luciano's downfall began to take shape. In 1936, he was arrested on charges of compulsory prostitution, a move that was seen as an effort to weaken his grip on the Mafia. The case against him was built on the testimony of women who had been forced into the sex trade, a development that left Luciano with few places to turn. Despite the charges being serious, Luciano's ability to manipulate the media and his connections in high places helped him avoid immediate conviction. His allies, such as the corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials who had helped him build his empire, worked behind the scenes to influence the proceedings, ensuring that Luciano was not easily brought to justice. However, despite his best efforts to avoid conviction, Luciano was ultimately sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison in 1936. This was a major blow to the Mafia, as it removed its most powerful and visionary leader from the game. But even in prison, Luciano's influence was far from diminished. In fact, it seemed as if his grip on the criminal underworld tightened during his incarceration. He didn't simply fade into the background. He adapted to his new reality and found ways to continue running his operations, even from behind bars. Luciano's prison years were a testament to his ability to adapt and maintain control in the face of adversity. While other men in his position might have been broken by the weight of their sentence, Luciano remained one of the most powerful figures in the Mafia. He used his time in prison to solidify his control over the various factions of the Mafia and maintain his influence in the business world. He continued to direct his allies in the street-level operations, and his network of loyalists ensured that his interests were protected. It was this combination of cunning, strategic thinking, and a network of loyal, capable associates that allowed Luciano to remain in control, even from prison. However, Luciano's time in prison would not last forever. In 1946, after serving a decade of his sentence, he was granted a controversial parole and deported to Italy. His release was a result of political maneuvering and pressure from his allies, as well as the realization by the government that Luciano was no longer as much of a threat as he had once been. But the return to Italy wasn't the end of his story, it marked a new chapter in Luciano's life. In Italy, Luciano continued to operate behind the scenes, using his contacts and influence to control various criminal activities. His involvement in the Mafia, particularly in Europe, continued to grow as he forged new alliances with the Italian crime families. Luciano's ability to adapt to changing circumstances, his willingness to bend the rules of the game, and his unrelenting drive to maintain control of his empire all ensured that even in exile, he remained a key player in the world of organized crime. His reputation as a master strategist and a cold-blooded operator continued to precede him. By the time Luciano died in 1962, his legacy was firmly cemented. He had helped to reshape the Mafia, transforming it from a fragmented, chaotic underworld into a unified, professional criminal enterprise. His ability to adapt to external pressures, whether from rival factions or from the government, was unparalleled. Luciano had created a system that was not just about power but about sustainability. He had learned how to thrive in a world that was constantly changing, and his story remains a testament to the enduring strength of the criminal mind. Luciano's downfall, while inevitable, was not the end of his influence. His empire continued to affect the world of organized crime for decades after his death. His legacy is not one of a single man's rise and fall, but of an era of transformation, one in which the Mafia was reinvented and restructured into something much larger and more powerful than anyone had ever imagined. Even in exile, even in death, Lucky Luciano remained a ghostly figure, a man whose impact on the criminal world could never truly be erased. The downfall of Lucky Luciano, like the rise that preceded it, was a series of calculated steps, each one a direct response to the mounting pressures and threats against his empire. Luciano's ability to manipulate situations and navigate dangerous waters had been a hallmark of his career, but no amount of cunning could ultimately shield him from the inevitable. Despite his sharp intellect, vast network of loyalists and power, the forces closing in were too strong. The death of the old Mafia order that he had helped create, his eventual arrest, and the unrelenting pressure from law enforcement led to the unraveling of everything he had worked to build. In the mid-1930s, as Luciano's empire grew, so too did the intensity of the federal government's attempts to dismantle it. His involvement in multiple criminal enterprises, gambling, drug trafficking, bootlegging, along with the sheer size and complexity of his operations, made him a prime target. But his most immediate threat came in the form of a case against him that would prove to be his undoing: the charge of compulsory prostitution. Prostitution had long been a significant source of income for organized crime families, and Luciano, with his business-minded approach to crime, was heavily invested in the operation. His ability to control the sex trade was a key part of his dominance, and it was through these operations that his eventual conviction would come. The prosecution focused on evidence that Luciano had orchestrated and profited from the exploitation of women forced into sex work. It was a brutal reminder of the darker aspects of the Mafia, and it played directly into the hands of law enforcement. In a time when public opinion was beginning to turn against the criminal underworld, the case became a symbol of the Mafia's destructive reach into society. While the charges were serious and the evidence damning, Luciano's ability to influence key figures, politicians, law enforcement officers, and the media, meant that he had a chance to escape the harshest punishment. Despite being arrested and tried, he remained confident, manipulating his way through the media and using his contacts to build an image of a man who was untouchable. Luciano's wealth, his extensive legal resources, and his influence in the corridors of power allowed him to stall and fight the charges for a time. But ultimately, despite his efforts, the court handed down a conviction. The sentence was staggering. Luciano was given 30 to 50 years in prison for his involvement in the prostitution racket. His fall from the apex of power was swift and brutal, and it marked the end of an era in the Mafia's history. But even as he was carted off to serve his sentence, it was clear that Luciano would not be easily broken. He was no ordinary mob boss. He had a vision for the future, and that vision didn't end with him in prison. His intellect, his connections, and his resilience would allow him to maintain control, even behind bars. Prison was, ironically, where Luciano's most enduring legacy as a criminal mastermind would take root. Rather than fading into obscurity, Luciano turned the prison system into a new platform for influence. He quickly became a powerful figure within the prison itself, commanding respect from both the other inmates and those outside who continued to operate his businesses. He maintained regular communication with his trusted lieutenants, orchestrating criminal activities from within his cell, and showing once again his remarkable ability to retain control over his empire even when physically removed from the day-to-day operations. But while Luciano's mind remained sharp and his grip on his criminal empire firm, it was becoming clear that the government was not finished with him. The political landscape was shifting, and new avenues were being explored to break up the Mafia and its stranglehold on American crime. The government's efforts were relentless, and in many ways Luciano's time in prison represented a period of heightened scrutiny. But the turning point came in 1946 when Luciano was granted an unexpected reprieve. It wasn't that he had been exonerated of his crimes, nor that his conviction was overturned. Instead, the deal that saw him released from prison was one born of pragmatism and compromise. Luciano's release was not the result of legal victory but political maneuvering, and it was the product of his lasting influence on those around him. He had served his time, but it was clear that his continued imprisonment no longer served the interests of the government. The question was not whether Luciano could be broken but whether he was still a threat to the country's stability. The answer was more complicated than anyone expected. One of the primary reasons for his release was his role in facilitating a key agreement during World War II. Luciano had been instrumental in assisting the U.S. government with intelligence-gathering efforts during the war, particularly regarding the protection of the docks in New York City. These docks were critical for the war effort, and Luciano, using his connections, ensured that the Mafia's influence in the area helped secure the transportation of goods and materials. This was a pragmatic decision on both sides. The government needed the Mafia's help to safeguard vital infrastructure, and Luciano, in return, sought a guarantee that he would be released from prison once the war ended. The decision to release Luciano was controversial, but it reflected the cold calculus of wartime politics. It also highlighted the irony of Luciano's life. He was a criminal mastermind, but at key moments he had been willing to work within the system to further his own goals. His release was not a sign of his redemption but a sign of his power. He had managed to turn his imprisonment into a negotiation tactic that benefited both him and the government. In exchange for his freedom, Luciano agreed to stay out of the public eye and to refrain from direct involvement in any criminal activities. However, anyone who knew him understood that this was a temporary solution. Luciano had always been a man who worked in the shadows, and the fact that he was now free again only meant that his influence would continue to extend beyond the prison walls. After his release, Luciano was deported to Italy, a move that seemed to signal the final chapter in his life. He had spent years building the Mafia into a global empire, but now, after all the bloodshed and betrayal, he was exiled from the land where he had become a household name. Italy, however, offered him an opportunity to continue his operations, albeit from a distance. In Europe, he quickly re-established himself in the world of organized crime, working with various factions in Italy as well as internationally to maintain his influence. But Luciano was not a man who lived only in the past. While his criminal empire had been massive, his interests were far more expansive. He had always been a man of ambition, and even in his final years he sought to maintain a role in the world of crime, albeit in a more subtle way. His connection to the Sicilian Mafia and the international narcotics trade remained strong, as he continued to act as a linchpin for the global network of criminals he had helped create. In the final years of his life, Luciano became something of a ghost, still influential, still powerful, but now operating in the shadows of the criminal underworld. His name had become synonymous with the transformation of the Mafia into the modern crime syndicate it was destined to become, but his role in that world was no longer the same. He was no longer the brash young man who had carved his name into the annals of criminal history. Instead, he was the elder statesman of the underworld, his actions now more restrained but no less impactful. Luciano died in 1962, not in a violent mob-related incident, but of a heart attack while living in exile in Naples, Italy. His death, while not shocking given his age, marked the end of an era in the world of organized crime. Luciano's legacy, however, continued to echo in the world he had helped shape. He had transformed the Mafia into an organization of discipline, strategy, and global reach, and in doing so, he had created a lasting framework for future generations of criminals. His story, one of rise, fall, and survival, became a symbol of the power of reinvention in a world where nothing, except change, was certain. Luciano's life was one marked by his ability to adapt, to survive, and to remain relevant in an ever-shifting criminal landscape. His downfall was inevitable, yet his influence remained unbroken until the end. Even in his final years, he continued to shape the future of organized crime, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire future generations of criminals and mob bosses. The man who once reigned as the most powerful figure in the Mafia had become a figure of myth, still feared, still respected, and in many ways still in control. The courtroom drama surrounding Lucky Luciano's trial in 1936 was a spectacle that captured the attention of the nation. It was a high-stakes legal battle that not only had personal implications for Luciano but also represented a turning point in the way the government and the public viewed organized crime. For Luciano, it wasn't just about defending himself against charges of compulsory prostitution. It was about maintaining his grip on the criminal empire he had so carefully constructed. The trial would be a public affair, and Luciano's ability to manipulate the media and influence public opinion would play a key role in the outcome. Luciano's arrest had been the culmination of years of pressure from law enforcement, particularly in the wake of Prohibition's end. His empire, which had thrived during the alcohol ban, had expanded into gambling, narcotics, and other illicit enterprises. But with the government beginning to focus more intently on organized crime, it became increasingly difficult for Luciano to operate without drawing attention. The charges against him were serious. He was accused of running a prostitution racket that exploited young women, a crime that carried severe penalties. The authorities had compiled evidence, including wiretaps and testimonies, making it clear that Luciano's operations were vast and ruthless. Despite the severity of the charges, Luciano's legal defense was formidable. His team of lawyers worked tirelessly to counter the prosecution's case, using every tactic available to create doubt in the minds of the jury. Luciano's defense strategy was not just about denying the charges but about presenting him as a victim of circumstance. His legal team argued that he was simply a businessman, a victim of political targeting, and that his criminal activities were no different from those of other powerful men in America. The media, which had followed his every move, played a crucial role in this narrative. Luciano was portrayed as a powerful but misunderstood figure, a man of influence who had been unfairly singled out.